Hello everyone and welcome to the Cube Talk Show. And my name is Joe Barbieri. I'm your host for tonight. We have two guests lined up tonight, as per usual. We'll be going into the macro aspect of money as well as the micro aspect, which is more of a internal subconscious aspect, but we'll also be linking them together. And our two guests tonight are Hugh Riley, who is the founder of ThatChannel.com, going up first, and in the second half we have Alexander Kupish, who is a returning guest, and he's authored a new book, so we'll be talking about that and the subject matter in it. So Hugh is in our studio, so welcome. How are you?
I'm great, Joe. Great to be on your show. Looking forward to this conversation, yeah.
So we're talking about the macro effect of currency. Would you like to expand on that? What would you like to say?
Whoa, that's a big topic. The macro effect of currency. Well, just an example that I find curious and kind of enlightening or whatever. It's like, people talk about the real estate market. Is it going to go up? Is it going to go down? We saw what happened in the U.S. with the bursting of the housing bubble, right?
Okay.
And in Canada, where people, of course, you never really know which way the market's going to go, up or down. But one of the things that I find is an important factor in the determination of housing values is the amount of money that's available to people to buy houses. So if there's a loose credit environment where a lot of people can get their hands on a lot of money, that's going to be more dollars chasing limited housing stocks, which means that we're going to see the price of housing go up, right?
Okay.
And then if something happens like the banks contract the availability of money that they're making available to people in the housing market, that's going to send house prices down because there's going to be fewer dollars available to chase the amount of real estate that's available. So to me, the banks are they're not just another player that are subject to housing prices. They are a big factor in the determinant in what determines housing prices. So if housing prices start to go down because there's no money available or less money available in the housing market, then the banks that are restricting access to that credit are at least in part responsible for the housing prices falling. So that's an example of what I think the macroeconomic, how you manage the money supply and how that money is made available to people is going to have a big impact, not just on prices, but on people's lives.
Okay. Are you so this is zeroing in on debt and borrowing, or is there more to it
Well,
than that?
I mean, in this particular example, it's not really I wouldn't say it's really about a discussion about debt or borrowing. It's really a question of money supply. Prices are determined by the money supply, and who determines the money supply. In the case of the housing market, banks determine how much money is available to buy houses, right? So if banks all of a sudden, because they get cold feet and they start to withdraw money from the marketplace, they are creating they are driving a self-fulfilling prophecy that the housing market is going to be bad. Because for them to think that they're just a non-causative player in the marketplace is just wrong. So so I think we have to, if you're talking about macroeconomic policy, I think you have to take these kinds of things into consideration. And also it opens up lots of cans of worms, like, if you're a particular homeowner that has been, because of bank policy, now you're made homeless, well, who's to blame for that? Because you, as an individual, are far more subject to events beyond your control in the marketplace and in the money supply, whereas the banks are not. Banks are major players based on their decisions, their policies. they can contract the market or expand it. And don't forget, there are beneficiaries of an expanding market, because now the houses are worth more, the banks are lending more, people are owing more to the banks. So that looks all great on the banks' books. But when the banks play a role in turning that all around, well, you know, banks may suffer something, but don't forget, they're going to go in and they're going to repossess those assets, those houses, and the people who otherwise, due to banking policy, can no longer afford those houses are going to be out on the street. So who suffers more, and who's got more control over what happens? That's all. Just food for thought.
Yeah, so the difference is the control or the influence on the market that a bank would have, for example, versus a individual. If a bank has whatever $100 billion worth of loans, they can affect what happens in the whole industry versus that one person that says, I have one house with $500,000 is
has virtually no influence on the marketplace. But when you're talking about banks, especially in Canada, where there's a very small oligopoly of banks, and who I'm sure never talk to each other over lunch, about what their collective policies are going to be. They're the ones that in a large part can determine the prices in the housing market, but also, the fate of people who are, struggling to stay in their homes.
So, would you say there's an alternative to this, or another way to go about it?
Well, when I look around at the macroeconomic problems that everybody is facing right now, whether it be, inflation or lack of, or deflation or hyperinflation or unemployment or government debt, some of the big macroeconomic problems that we collectively face, and I look for solutions to that. What always comes back to me as being the point, of maximum leverage, like where you can make a little change that's going to have the biggest effect, is redefining what money is. That's what I, when I really look at kind of everything, my prescription for that ultimately is a redefinition of currency and an opening up of currency to a free market. Because although you hear lots of people preaching about free markets, open markets, and that sort of thing, and all the benefits of that, well, I think that should be extended, not restricted, but extended to who creates currency itself. I think that right now we have a situation where essentially the government, or the Bank of Canada, or the Fed in the U.S. has a monopoly over, who creates the currency. So we have a monopoly currency. It's kind of like monoculture in agriculture. If you have, one type of wheat that's grown around the world, and there's a disease that comes in and causes a lot of it to be destroyed, then a lot of people are going to go hungry, because you don't have natural checks and balances. You don't have multiple varieties of wheat, some of whom are going to be resistant to the disease, whatever it is. So, when we have a monopoly currency, and if we've got some kind of illness that comes in, whether that be hyperinflation or whether it be just mismanagement of the currency, and we have, like, for example, if something happens to the US dollar, well, the whole United States is going to be affected negatively by it. Whereas if you had, and this comes around to the idea of, like, what should back a currency, because a lot of people right now seem to be advocating, we have to return to the gold standard, which to me is a ridiculous idea. But what isn't a ridiculous idea to me, because I think because we can't eat gold, right? It has no intrinsic value. That may be a whole other subject, but I think that what you need to back money is productive capacity. is the thing that makes the most sense to back a currency. So, because if you've got the capacity to create goods and services that people need, and you divide that by the number of units of currency in circulation, then you've got a real measurement there. You know, the problem is with a monopoly currency, like a government currency, if a government gets into trouble with something, say like, oh, quantitative easing or whatever, and all of a sudden the number of dollars chasing the number of goods in circulation and the capacity to produce products and services that people want, then you've got a hyperinflationary scenario. But if you divide the productive capacity by the or you back the currency with the productive capacity, then there's no need for there to get a hyperinflation out of control. And also you then and open it up so that you open it up to productive institutions like companies, corporations, especially companies that are very well vertically integrated, that produce a large range of products and services and trade with it within itself. Then you've got a lot of great capacity to back a currency. And that company, by creating a currency, will be rewarded by making good decisions. It makes good decisions. In other words, it leverages more and more productive capacity for a relatively fewer number of currency units in circulation. Then that currency will get stronger and stronger, and that company will have better and better purchasing power. And the good decisions will be rewarded by the marketplace.
So this is something like competition.
Yeah.
The theory of competition is if you have 5 or 6 companies making something, the best, most efficient company wins in terms of, and the people decide by buying that company's good versus the other 5 that aren't quite as good.
Exactly.
So that company will win, but then the game doesn't end. There's someone else will come and say, well, I can do better than that and make it even better.
Yeah.
And the tide shifts to that company, and so this keeps happening.
And you don't have the danger of there being a debilitating hyperinflation. When you've got a monopoly currency controlled or mismanaged, and we've seen it happen, and there are people making arguments now that the U.S. situation is being mismanaged, and that there's a danger perhaps of the U.S. currency tipping into hyperinflation. Well, that's what happens. You have a bunch of people managing that currency, and I'm not saying, yay or nay or good or ill intentions. I'm just saying if it gets to a situation where it gets mismanaged and that happens, well, instead of having everybody suffer, why not let every company that is producing real goods and services that people need create a currency so that those currencies can fluctuate up and down against one another in a free market. And the marketplace will reward the currencies that are whose management teams are making the right decisions with respect to that currency.
So the word currency, as you're describing it, is that, well, basically exchange? Is it basically just what you make, or is it how you measure what you make? Is it...
that's the thing. It's like, what is money? This goes to the whole question of what is money, and it's a really interesting question that I find not enough people ask. People tend to just accept money as money. Money is money, without asking what are the rules or what is the definition of this. And the definition is what does that money do? What are the rules about that money? Because money is abstract. You can say it's a piece of paper. You can say it's a check. You can say it's information on a credit card or numbers in an account. But all those things relate to one another. And you take all those things collectively and you understand the rules about how that works, including interest and all that sort of thing. And then you have an idea of what money is, right? So, so I would probably, if it were up to me, redefine several of those things about money.
Okay, so if I were to ask you right now, which I guess I will, how would you redefine it? I think you've said some of it already in terms of the competitive.
Well, opening it up to the free market and allowing anybody who can support it with productive capacity create their own currency would be one. And we already do that to a certain extent. Coupons are a kind of currency. Gift certificates are another kind of currency. You know, so we already do some of this. But you know, things like interest, the whole concept of interest and interest rates is another thing that I would invite people to look at. And also, there's a lot of historical, cultural objections to the whole idea of interest. I think the Muslims don't like to charge interest, and I think even in the Jewish and Christian, going back a long time ago, they forbade the charging of interest, or usury it was called. It was a bad idea. And in a way, even present day economists often will say, well, what causes inflation? Any inflation? It's interest that causes inflation, because interest requires you to pay more money than what you borrowed originally. Well, where does that extra money come from? Well, it has to be printed, has to be created, and that extra creation of that is not necessarily tied to an increase in goods and services that are available. And so when those things aren't tied together, there will be inflation. So arguably it is inflation that causes interest that causes inflation. And the other thing is, but people are going to argue, well, we need to charge interest to pay for the risk of lending. Okay, well, in the old days, maybe that made sense. If I was going to go into my vault and get a bunch of gold out and give it to you, lend it to you, and I would say, you know, I might not get this back, I need to charge interest because of the risk that I may not get it back. But today, when nobody's reaching in their vault and getting gold, in fact, the money that banks lend on mortgages, for example, is not even physically real. So it's really simply numbers in a bank account. And so what is real that is being lent that there is a risk of not getting? That's the question I'm raising. And so what is the risk? Especially when the bank is a player in the determination of the price of those houses, and will go in if that mortgage is not being paid and seize that asset. And so the bank can seize the asset, and in fact the bank can inflate the market. So in a sense there's no risk. So I think you can but you can then the question is, so what I'm saying is that there's no need to have interest as a measure of the risk of lending today. And in fact, if we look at an economy where there is open competition of currencies, a company, and this is where we get to like the smart decisions that a currency management team can make. The currency management team says, okay, we want to invest in something, because a lot of times businesses borrow money at interest to grow their businesses. And those decisions, if they're making smart decisions, will grow the productive capacity of which is the idea, right? We want to invest in production and productive capacity, right? But if in a free market of currencies, a company decides to create money out of thin air, not charge interest for it, but essentially create it out of thin air to invest in productive capacity, if that's the right decision and productive capacity is indeed created, and it is able to produce goods and services that people need in excess of the actual currency units that were created out of thin air to create that real capacity, then there will be no inflation. In fact, inflation will decrease, and there will be no interest rates to spark the inflation. So again, this is another example of how good decisions about how those management teams, utilize that power to create currency is going to, it's the free market again reinforcing good decision making, where's the best place to make those investments, interest-free investments.
So it's not the interest in itself, but it's how it's used. So rather than just creating it, you're going to link that interest to whatever that capacity is, and that's its way of balancing itself out.
Yeah, for example, say it was GM, just for maybe an easy example. GM wants to increase its, they want to build a new plant, right? So, because they see in the market will demand more cars, they need to increase their capacity. So instead of going out to a third party and borrowing money, try to convince someone else to take a risk and lend GM the money to build a plant, GM says, you know what, we're just going to create the currency. This is assuming, of course, there's a marketplace where people are used to trading in this way. But GM can create that money on itself. It doesn't need to ask anybody else. And therefore, this is a way to also decentralize the power and let everybody be empowered through their own currency, their own ability to create their own currency. GM creates the currency and people believe in the GM currency because they made good decisions in the past. They are able to build a plant. They're able to, they're not paying any interest on the money that they created. They've created the new plant. They're producing cars, and the total amount of currency in circulation divided by the productive capacity of GM remains the same, because they invested that money that they created out of thin air wisely in real capacity for goods and services.
So now if somebody said, okay, this sounds good, but what happens when we have to exchange with other countries or around the world? I assume you can just do the same thing. Whatever if there's 5 or 6 currencies, say there's 5 or 6 main currencies that the biggest players use, all 6 of them can be traded with another country's 5 or 6 and exchange however way that it works out. Is that how you see that?
Yeah, I see. I think that what would happen is there would be a natural marketplace would emerge where currencies would be traded one against another. And so the marketplace would, just as it does now in the stock market or the currency markets, would say, well, you know, this company's doing this and they seem to be good decisions in this company. And don't forget, the companies are creating the currencies. Essentially, currencies go with companies, because companies have the capacity to, through the synergistic use of their resources, to create products and services in productive capacity. So those are probably the best entities to be able to create currencies that will maintain their value, because companies are used to, you know, making things work and making things be sustainable and producing products and services, because that's what they do. So the marketplace would look at that and say, okay, this is, you know, this should be worth more, this should be less. There'd probably be futures trading and all that kind of stuff, and the marketplace would just naturally emerge to kind of be a self-regulating measure of currency value relative to other currencies. And you know, anywhere there's people and there's resources, and the ability of people to work with their local resources to create products or services that other people want, is the opportunity for them to create companies and currencies that they can trade with other companies and currencies anywhere in the world.
Now, I smile here because I think about government. Now, if this were to go on, the government would have to make something and make a currency based on what they made, versus just a de facto currency that's now existing, and they'd have to compete. This is what I can tell from what's being built.
Yeah, this is why you should sell real estate if you live in Ottawa. Because, yeah, you're right. I mean, governments who are notoriously bad at creating anything would have a difficult time in this kind of a system. I mean, having said that, you know, there is a need, I think, for, you know, communal decision making and collective governance that somebody has to look after, and it may not necessarily be related to the money function, right? So that's a whole separate issue about how we make collective decisions. You know, and then so how do you fund that, and all those kind of issues that arise. But you know, but that's a whole other.
Well, that used to be taxes. That's what taxes were supposed to do.
Right.
Originally.
I mean, and you could still have taxes in a system like this, and you could pay them with different currencies, and you know, and the government would then theoretically be able to continue to operate, but you would just free up the economy a lot more that often now is penalized by unfair taxation, and that a lot of that money we know is being wasted. You know, every year the ombudsman at all levels of government comes up and says, well, we're wasting literally billions of tax dollars because they're just not spending the money wisely, because they're not a private sector company that has to survive, make smart decisions with its money. So, I mean, that's just the nature of things. So we know things are going to have to change there at some point anyway. But what I'm saying is that the currency system need not necessarily mean that we have to make radical changes in the government system. It would just mean that the government doesn't need to be in the currency management game anymore. And in fact, even the idea that central banks, because central banks have sort of taken the role of money management out of government, because people have become aware that it's probably unwise to let people who have to be elected every 4 years make decisions about how to manage currency, because they're going to spend money to buy votes, which is ultimately going to lead to economic chaos and probably hyperinflation. So, yeah.
I'll throw one more question at you.
Okay.
I believe, well, before central banks, so say 100 years ago, I think this kind of system actually existed, because they had local currencies for cities, for towns, for states, for fledgling countries,
and banks,
regions, and there were
all the
private
banks
issued,
in Canada had their own currencies.
and banks. So
yeah.
the system did exist, and it must have worked because we got here. So, and I think, well, I think this can be argued, but the reason why they got out of that was because of trust, and they basically counterparty trust. Now, if somebody were to ask, so would that be an issue now? Let's say each bank had a currency and I decided to use it and the bank went bankrupt and I lost whatever I had in that currency. Now, I think part of that would self-regulate, but what would you say to that as a concern?
Well, I think that the banks probably aren't the best people either to be managing currencies, because they're not really creating anything either. So it might be different if productive companies were actually creating the currency, not banks. I think also too, history goes through cycles of centralization and decentralization. And so I think when those bank and small local currencies consolidated in national currencies, we were seeing an overall like the world was dividing itself up into nation states. So it was just a natural historical trend. So, you know, nation states didn't always exist, and nation states may not exist forever. I mean, it's just a phase in overall history. So I think it may have been part of that, or the trend to national currencies was part of the trend to nation states, and we may be moving away from that now.
So that's very interesting. We have a couple of minutes before a break. Do you want to give a website or a contact information, which you think we already did at the beginning, but if there's anything you want to add to...
Well, you know, I'd be interested in talking to other people who are who think that these ideas make sense, and who might want to... I think it's all talk unless these ideas get applied. I think also that, you know, I mean, things are okay today, but I think there's some storm clouds on the horizon with respect to our, you know, overall macro and economic management of our economy. And so I think that, you know, applying some of these ideas might be a smart thing to do, to just help people ride out whatever trouble might be on the horizon. And I'd be interested in talking to people that might be interested in working on applying some of these ideas. So you can go to our website, ThatChannel.com, and you can get in touch with me and with the rest of us here at That Channel. Contact us at ThatChannel.com is the email address.
Okay, thanks very much, and we'll take a break for a couple of minutes, and we'll be back with Alexander very soon.
Okay, thanks, Joe.
Thoughts so heavy weigh on my mind. You never call, so I decide pick up and go with no direction. Your face is burning into my mind. Your face is burning on my mind. Your face is burning into my mind. Your face is burning on my mind. Your face is burning into my mind. Your face is burning on my mind. Your face is burning into my mind. Your face is burning on my mind. People on the street, they squeak and drone. My feet below me, they feel so cold. Your face is burning to my mind. Your face is burning on my mind. Your face is burning to my mind. Your face is burning on my mind. Your face is burning to my mind. Your face is burning on my mind. Your face is burning to my mind. Your face is burning on my mind. Oh, where can I run? Where can I run? Where can we run? Your face is burning to my mind. Your face is burning on my mind. Your face is burning to my mind. Your face is burning on my mind. Your face is burning to my mind. Your face is burning on my mind. Your face is burning to my mind. Your face is burning on my mind. Your face is burning to my mind. Your face is burning on my mind. Your face is burning to my mind. Your face is burning on my mind. My mind. My mind. My mind.
Okay, welcome back to the Cube Talk Show, and this is our second half. And we have Alexander Kupish in the studio. Now, he wrote a book recently. I'll just read the title of it. It's Holistic Creation and Focus Zone Qigong, and that's the cover of it on your screen. So, so Alex, welcome back.
Thank you.
How are you?
Good, good. Thank you for having me back on the show.
So I think we're going along the same theme about money, but going more into a internal creation aspect. So,
well, so basically what we want to focus on is the creative energy. Earlier on, you know, you were speaking in regards to the fact that when government prints money, they don't, you know, the government doesn't actually create anything, you know, and it doesn't really work. And it doesn't really work when banks print money because they don't actually do anything, you know. So there is no energy of creation there, you know. And when you're not consistently creating, when energy is not flowing, the only thing that happens is that you can have what is already here, you know. It will never transform. The wealth doesn't flow. And when the energy gets stuck like this, what it does is it brings in the energy of hoarding, because you can never create anything more, so you want to hoard, you know. And this is why there's so much hoarding going on, you know. If you look at the classes of, you know, people who make a great deal of money and people who make very little, the poor class is increasing, the middle class is decreasing, and the super rich, they're much more wealthy now than they were before, even though, you know, there's only maybe 1% of the people who are super wealthy, their wealth is consistently increasing, you know. So it's through that energy, there is an unequal transfer, unequal spread of wealth, of resources, you know, that are available to everyone. And, you know, that's when you get into this type of vibration, that's when you get into, again, trying to control things. You know, people are trying to control how much oil is available, how much diamonds are available, how much all these things are available. And ways of living where where a resource cannot be controlled, such as wind energy or solar energy, was never explored, you know, or it was explored. I mean, people have, since the 1960s and the 1970s, have been building all kinds of, you know, diesel engines that can travel, you know, 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers on very little fuel. People have built all kinds of things, but big corporations were never really interested in that, because they're not interested in spreading wealth. They're not interested in spreading energy. They're not interested in things that are available to everyone, and that is wealth. You know, what they're interested in is this illusion that we've built, you know.
So this is tied to the creation, because they're not creating something. So the converse of it is that
in order to create, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, you know. So natural resources are already here. We have the sun, we have wind, we have heat, we have all kinds of things that, for example, will produce energy that will heat our homes, energy that will move us, energy, you know, that will do all kinds of, you know, allow us to produce more things. And that energy is readily available. However, when you don't work with the earth, with what is already here on this physical plane, and you get into the idea that you want to have energy that is not readily available to everyone, you're actually going against nature, and you will create a shortage. Because because basically the corporation, the big company, they cannot exist without a shortage. If diamonds become available easily, if oil becomes easily, if people start to drive electric cars, if there is wind power energy that is available easily, then I'm not gonna go and try to purchase something from you when I can just have it because it's already here. Energy is here. The idea that energy is scarce is ridiculous because it's everywhere. It's in wind, it's in nature, it's everywhere.
And the people who've said they're successful have tapped into this and said, I just create things and they just come. And they keep on coming. They don't see any limit to what they can create. And
yes.
That can go all the way up to a country, a company.
Yes, that is correct.
So
it can.
It ties into the same idea.
Yes. It's just it's basically, on the end of the day, it's all about flow. And it's all about staying in that vibration. The idea that money itself, it has no power there, and therefore, since it has no power, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just a representation. But it depends what it represents. You see, when money represents something that is available to us readily, when it is used to trade those things, there is a much more degree of freedom attached to it. So, for example, if you build a vehicle, okay, and now that vehicle is a solar-powered vehicle, right? So solar energy is readily available, from the sun. So if I give you a certain amount of money for that vehicle, there is a transaction, and now this energy, we have this exchange of energy. But in order for me to go from point A to point B with this vehicle, the vehicle is powered by the sun. So I don't have to engage now in purchasing fuel for the vehicle, like diesel fuel or gasoline fuel, because the sun is available. Where if I have a gas-powered vehicle, now we get into the thing where gas prices can be manipulated. Okay, so the energy gets kind of screwed up there. It gets stuck. Yeah.
Or it gets funneled.
Yeah.
I envision this as a river. When it flows, a river keeps flowing infinitely. There's always more water coming down the river. But when you stop it, by damming it, the water stagnates and a lot of stuff that's in the water actually dies.
I mean, if you really look, you can look at it this way. If I give you something, if I give you a product, right? Maybe what I envision is for you to take that product, make it your own, flow with it, do whatever you got to do with it. And a long time ago, when vehicles were made in a very simple way, when you, let's say, purchased a vehicle, you were able to do a lot of the repairs on the vehicle yourself, and they were made to last. Today, there's vehicles, I'm not going to mention names, but there are vehicles out there, and we're talking about small, family compact vehicles, where to change a timing belt, you have to take half the car apart, the front end of the vehicle. It costs a lot of money, and you become dependent on the supply network that is built now to service your car. So the whole idea of, when these corporations sell you something, they sell it to you with the intent that they want to make more and more and more money off of it. It's always about you spending the energy. It's almost like the things that we buy now end up tying us instead of creating more,
Yeah, this is actually a strategy.
It is a strategy.
I experienced this with my printer. I had an inkjet printer, and the printer's cheap. This was 4 years ago, and it was $100, but the ink to refill the ink costed $50. And after 6 months, I paid more than the printer, and I thought, well, I don't want to do this, so I switched to a laser printer, and that scenario was, well, it's still there, but it's reduced a lot.
Yes.
But I learned about that whole idea that a lot of companies sell you something for the maintenance. The thing itself is just
the maintenance of the thing becomes a business, you know.
More so than the thing you're buying. Yeah.
It is very natural. For example, if you look at the housing industry, it is very natural for a human being to want a home, and a human being with, you know, we get into energy now, but a human being with a healthy root chakra, a healthy root, will automatically be able to create or receive the gift of a home and of a family, and will lead a balanced life. Okay? Now, if that energy within the human being becomes distorted somehow, then there will be a wanting. Okay? And this is why, you know, if you look at some of the Toronto neighborhoods, like for example Little Italy and stuff, you see the homes are very small. And 50, 60 years ago, it was not uncommon for 8 to 8 people to live in that little home, where today everybody wants a huge home, you know, a 3,000 square foot home, because it's like, you know, they're trying, there's a need, there's a want. Now that want was marketed to us, marketed to us by companies whose interest it is for us to get into debt. However, at a certain point, one must take responsibility for themselves, because that what is out there, those marketing things, only exist because there's enough people responding to them.
Yeah.
And so, you know, this is when we get into the idea that this was actually created by us, you know, because the truth is that you can be fine living in a small home. You know, so today it's more about fulfilling our desires than our basic needs. And when we are so busy to fulfill our desires, it's very difficult to get into, you know, the heart center, where things like control, attachments, aversions, voids become very diminished. You know, so people keep on looking for the outside. Well, the act of looking, you know, it's an action. It's an action of seeking. That seeking burns energy, and that energy needs to be fulfilled, and it's fulfilled in various different ways. You know, today we eat more than we've ever ate in history. We spend more money. We take on larger debt. Everything is more and more and more. We need more energy to keep the whole thing going. You know, and it's built on shortage. So
the key to this thing, the key to the whole idea, is creating versus spending or using up energy.
Well, you know, I get into this. I talk about this in my book in a pretty detailed manner. But basically, everything happens because it's a vibration that's also inside of you. Okay? So this is why it's very important to do basic energy work before you make any type of a decision, including whether you need to spend money on something or not. You know, and by balancing yourself, you can then clearly see if the decision that you're going to be making is coming from an attachment or an aversion, or it's coming from trying to fill some void, you know. And if you allow yourself to sit in meditation and fully experience the having something or not having it, you know, you will find that very often the whole energy just dissipates, and where there was going to be action that would have been driven from either wanting or not wanting something, now there is no action, you know, because those things were just energies.
So now, instead of that action, there would be creation instead.
Well, yes, eventually there will be a creation because, you know, you will not be channeling your energy into satisfying a desire of something that you never wanted. You know, when you know, a lot of people are young, they have many dreams, you know, they want to do certain things. Nobody gets up and say, I really want to have a 4,000 square foot home and a 5 Series. They don't know what those things are. Children do not know what those things are. They are concepts. Concepts that exist in the adult's mind, but not in the child's mind. You know, and whenever we get into the heart center, we always speak about the children, you know, or the internal child, whatever you want to call it. You know, because it's these concepts that enslave the subconscious mind. You know, but the person who learned those concepts is nothing more than an identity that is trying to fulfill these desires. You know, so through non-dualistic inquiry, you can find out if all of this is real, if all of it is true, for just an illusion. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the internal. It's the internal way of translating what's out there in terms of, if I'm gonna go and buy all this stuff, what for?
Yes.
That's how it translates out there.
Yeah. I mean, I can give you you know, I guess an example from my own personal life would be sailing. This upcoming summer, I will be doing a great deal of sailing, and that is something that I've always loved since I was a child. You know, that's not something that I was socialized to do. You know, so this is an energy of flow. You know, this is not a hobby that I got because I looked at somebody else or whatever. This is just something that is flowing. You know, so this comes from the heart. You know, so when you get into this stuff, you know, it's not only about hobbies. You know, it's about your life, your work. It's about everything. It's about how you interact with people. And you get exchanges of energy.
Exchanges, yeah. That's how we started the show, with currency. So
yeah,
it's the internal currency.
It's the internal currency, and it's the internal currency is love, and it's trust. Trust that is beyond you know, attachments and aversions. Trust that doesn't hinder itself you know, on an outcome. You just know that everything is falling into place at all times.
So a trust in the situation, like
well, basically, you know, you made a remark that on the previous half of the show that you know, you can have various 100 years ago, various banks used to print their own currency, but that ended because what if I take this currency and that bank goes bankrupt? You know, so basically, it's very funny because what you said it can actually be described in a math formula. You know, in a game. And you know, I'm talking about the prisoner's dilemma.
yeah,
You know, that's a game, and the theory is called the game theory. And the person who actually made this received a Nobel Prize. They were schizophrenic when they came up with the formula. And the person recently in a documentary spoke for about half an hour, about 10 years ago, spoke for about half an hour, saying that, look, this is wrong because there's an assumption that the other person will cheat you, that other person will not do well. And it's funny, you know, our world has been run on these assumptions. You know, if you look at the Cold War, you know, the strategy of the Cold War was actually was actually run from rooms where they did mathematical calculations, trying to figure out what were the chances of the Russians attacking them, because it was always assumed that the Russians are going to attack, and the only way you can deter them from attacking is if you have more rockets. If they attack you, you will attack them, and then everybody will die. So fear created more fear, and then, you know, security was found within that fear based on the fact that nobody really wants to die, that everybody is trying to survive. But from this illusion, the Cold War was created, you know. And if you look at that, the relationship of what you said with the bank is also true. You know, the bank might go bankrupt. Okay, well, that's okay. There's plenty of more energy, you know, available. And guess what? The currency system as we know today is bankrupt. So even though we tried all these things and we tried to centralize everything, you know, we took away the right of provinces and cities and goldsmiths and banks to print their own currency, and we have now our own currency, just one currency, like you know, the US dollar, the Canadian dollar. And then there's some places where they're trying to make a currency for the whole continent, like the euro dollar. It still didn't work. It still failed. The US government is practically bankrupt. I think it was Iceland that filed for bankruptcy. You have Spain, you have Greece, you have tremendous problems. It doesn't work. You know, control doesn't work in the long run. It always fails.
Yeah, it's food for thought.
You know, yeah.
So we have a few minutes left. If you want to, would you like to give a website, contact information?
Yeah, so my website address is www.holisticcreation.ca, and the title of my book is Holistic Creation and Focus Zone Qigong, and it's available for sale at various retailers. My email address is holisticcreation@hotmail.com. Yeah, if you have any questions or if you're looking for more information, you can give me an email. And basically the book is written as a course, so it's self-explanatory in regards to how to release the energy.
Okay, that sounds good.
Right,
so okay, well, that's our show for tonight, and that's the Cube Talk show for this evening. It will be posted on my website, www.joetheinvestor.ca. And until next month, the show time is the third Tuesday of the month at 6 p.m. And have a good evening.
If you're hateful, don't want you. If you're mean, don't want you. If you judge, don't want you. Don't want you, don't want you. If you're straight, I love you. If you're gay, I love you. If you're bi, I love you. I love you, I love you. If you're special, I love you. If you're sad, I love you. If you're human, I love you. I love you, I love you. Make a better world. Don't judge, don't judge. Open up your mind. Don't judge, don't judge. Make a better world. Don't judge, don't judge. Open up your mind. Don't judge, don't judge. If you're hateful, don't want you. If you're mean, don't want you. If you judge,